Now we move on to the second part of this lecture and talk about a visual perception theory. Human perception plays a very important role in the areas of information visualization. We will try to understand how human perception works so that we can improve the quality of the information display and the design issues. We are interested in how human visual perceptual system works because we want to understand how the visual variables and how the design of visualization affect the perception of information from the visual display. There are so many theories trying to explain how human visual system works, and we're going to introduce one of the most important theory, which is called a two-stage of information processing in visual perception. So this theory differentiates two stages. Stage 1, we call it pre-attentive processing, and stage 2, we call it the post-attentive processing. The two-stage model of visual perception basically stated that stage 1 is a process that trying to detect the basic features like colors and shapes and texture. So when the light source reflected from the object come into human eye, rather than just simply taking a picture, the human eyes will do some quick processing to pick up those features. And these features will be available for later more semantic processing. This will be kind of the identification of objects will happen in the second stage. For example, if we look at the things outside the window, we first see the colors and textures, and before we recognize that it is a tree, we can actually pick up a lot of those textures. Process of picking up the object as a tree is in the second stage of processing. And the second stage is more sequential and is more guided by your goals and your objectives. The two stages of visual processing has many fundamental differences. Stage 1, we talk about neurons in the eye that perceive the light sources in parallel fashion, and it will do quick detection of orientation, colors, and textures, and movement, etc. So the arrays of neurons can process very fast and a very high speed. And we can say the process is so fast it's almost automatic. That means it takes a very short period of time. The first stage, the information only stored temporarily. So in cognitive science, we call this iconic store of visual information. The process in stage 1 mainly is data-driven, is bottom-up, is basically what data can tell us. Overall, we call this stage 1 as pre-attentive visual information processing stage. In contrast to stage 1, stage 2 is a more sequential searching of target and identification of the meaningful objects in the scene. In stage 2, humans will likely to use their knowledge stored in long-term memory and use that to interpret the features and textures. So in that sense, it is goal-driven, it's a top-down process, and the significant part of this stage 2 is that it requires attention, which is a limited resource. Let's do an experiment. I'm going to show you a picture in the middle of this slide, and you need to tell me what it is. Take a piece of paper and write down what you see. Let's do this experiment again. This time I will let you just watch this picture for a little longer. Now tell me what you see. So the two experiments you just did actually you have looked at the same picture. However, in the first experiment, you only have a very short view of the picture. is about 300 milliseconds. And the second experiment, you have about 10 seconds of watching the picture. So the difference is that in the first experiment, you only have the time to do pre-attentive processing. Okay, so the nature of the pre-attentive processing is that usually it can happen between 200 and 250 milliseconds. So it's just about when I move to the focus in the picture is gone. So you have no time to do more processing than picking up the features. Okay? However, if you want to identify more semantic level of meaning, you do need more time. So the second experiment, you have 10 seconds, and you have time to do the second stage of visual processing, where you can watch the picture where it looks like an apple, but in fact on the apple is inscribed a word map. So that kind of processing will take longer for you to recognize. Let's do another experiment. Watch the sequence of numbers I'm going to show you. Please tell me how many threes in this picture. Now, do you have your answer? Please write down your answer. And also tell me whether you are confident on what you find. In the next experiment, I'm going to show the numbers in a different way and ask you to answer the same question. How many threes in the picture? Now tell me how many threes you find and how confident you are. The last two experiments we just did show the fact that if the numbers are presented in the right way, the pre-attentive processing could pick up those very quickly. Okay, this kind of work is called target detection. So there's 4 threes in both pictures, but the first presentation is hard to detect because you have to go through a serial search, sequential search of all the numbers. And even that, you're not sure whether you have counted all the threes. But on the second representation, the figures, the threes, are distinct from the background. So your visual processing can quickly pick it up. Okay, so this kind of target detection and counting or small number of counting can be good application for pre-attentive processing. Let's do experiment number 5. In the brief picture I'm going to show you, tell me if there's any red circles in the picture. Let's do experiment number 6. In the brief picture I'm going to show you, tell me if there's any red circles in the picture. The last two experiments helps to demonstrate the fact that the color hue can be used to represent the target as long as we can separate the surrounding object from the target objects. Then the pre-attentive processing can be possible. Let's do experiment number 7. In the brief picture I'm going to show you, tell me if there's any red circles in the picture. Again, you'll be looking for red circles. Let's do experiment 8 to repeat this target identification task. In the brief picture I'm going to show you, tell me if there's any red circles in the picture. Again, you'll be looking for red circles. So the conclusion we may draw from the last two experiments is that the visual variable shape can be processed pre-attentively by most people, although it's not as effective as color. Let's do experiment 9. In the brief picture I'm going to show you, tell me if there's any red circles in the picture. Again, you'll be looking for red circles. Experiment 10. In the brief picture I'm going to show you, tell me if there's any red circles in the picture. Again, you'll be looking for red circles. In the experiment 9 and 10, you are asked to tell whether there's a red circle in these two pictures. Okay, then the pictures actually mix the shapes and color in one picture and make it hard for people to actually pick immediately. For example, red circle. You have to search for red first, and then you have to search for circle. And anything that is not red and not circle in the same time, you have to reject. Okay? So this two dimension make it hard for you to decide quickly. I'm hoping that you have experienced the short time that I gave to you was not enough for you to make a judgment. So looks like by combining who and shapes, the search process becomes sequential, which slow down the process. Okay, so if you want to enable people to pick up patterns quickly, you better avoid this kind of multiple visual variables mixing together. Our next experiment is about a boundary detection. In the picture below, try to find a boundary that can separate things that have very distinct visual features. Now do the same experiment on another picture. Do you see a boundary in this picture? In the last two experiments, you have looked at the picture that both have squares and dots, but they have very different filling patterns and distribution. So on the picture on the left, we see a clear boundary between the second row and the third row because the filling color is very distinct. On the pictures on the right, we don't really see very easily the boundary. In fact, there is a boundary between the third column and fourth column, but the boundary is defined by both the shapes and the color. Okay, so if you draw a line between third column and fourth column, you see those things on the left will have dark circle and white square. Things on the right have dark square and white circle. However, we'll find that it's much slower and harder to see that boundary. Okay? So in conclusion, we find that boundary is better defined by one of the visual variable than mixing two visual variables. The next group of experiments try to study the effect of color hue and shapes to the boundary detection task. So in this picture, do you see a boundary? Can you see it very quickly? Let's look another picture. Do you see a boundary on this picture? Is that clear immediately? Can you think of which visual variable defines the boundary? What we would like to conclude from the last two experiments is the effect of shapes and hue value on the boundary detection task. The picture on the left uses color hue to separate the region between boundaries, and pictures on the right use shapes. Obviously, the visual variable of color hue doing a much better job than shape, because we find we are slower in doing the boundary detection task on the right picture than the left picture. We have used a dozen of experiments to show the effects of those visual variables like shape and color and intensity, and how they have effects on the common tasks like target detection and boundary detection and counting. But we have a lot more features that actually have similar effects. Here we have a list of all the pre-attentive visual features that could be used to design the pre-attentive supporting task. However, keep in mind that using two or more of these pre-attentive features together for a certain task may destroy the pre-attentive processing capability. So try to avoid using more than two. I would like to conclude this lecture by making two general comments. One is that the reason for us to understand visual perception is to do a better job on designing information display. In general, we prefer that if we can design the information visualization so that the pre-attentive processing on the common task like target detection and boundary detection or grouping can be done fast and accurate. And that feature is very desirable when we try to choose from many possible design strategies. Okay? And second comment is that this kind of feature is actually very fragile. If you are not very cautious on doing that, and use more than two features of the visual features for designing visual display, there's a potential that it will destroy the pre-attentive processing. Other than that, it's more creative aspect of visual design, and I hope you can learn from practice.